glad you mentioned the African continent. There's a strong focus on, I guess, how human rights and political instability, if you will, and I mean trade and investment, etc., into the African continent. There's quite a common thread of those pillars. And what is the main thing that you sort of picked up specifically in the human rights area? I mean, you were a research intern at the HRC.
Yeah.
What are some of the things that you sort of picked up there that you saw, and how have those things sort of changed since you've left, and also growing the career a little bit?
Yeah. So some of the things that one picked up, or one that one picks up, and I say one picks up is because nothing much has changed, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm.
It's almost as if it's the same script, different day. So, for the longest time, the things afflicting African states and African politics have been just political instability, conflict, the sort of inability to reconcile the expectation that there'll be what we in a classical sense identify as democracy.
Yes.
And the pursuit of trying to consolidate this democracy where we live by certain norms that are sort of internationally established and accepted.
Okay.
And Africa has, as always, and I'm not saying Africa as in Africa as a monolithic entity, but these are common characteristics across so many African countries where political elites just cannot agree to the rules of engagement and sort of agree to sort of putting citizens first.
Okay.
The African state and proximity to state power and access to resources is what is a livelihood, is a source of livelihood
for these states,
for a lot of African political elites. And outside of this sort of bubble of being close to political power, there's no alternatives because there's no development, and this sort of causes a whole ecosystem of dysfunction in African politics. And that has been the case like ever since my days at the Human Rights Commission, moving into Parliament and moving to the NGO sector up to now. That has been the sort of common thread that's sort of characterized African politics.
I'm glad you mentioned the fact that there's a lot of commonality on the African continent. There was a lot of exposure that you had while you were working at the embassy, and that was an international lens that you could apply. What did that sort of show you about the international community versus what it is we have in Africa, and how difficult it is for us to sort of just get to a point of stability to say this is the direction we're going to be moving forward in as a continent and as a country? So what did that sort of exposure give you in terms of just learnings and some insights about international versus continental?
That was an interesting period and an interesting experience to work for the Dutch embassy. And I think in a nutshell, to put it simply, it showed me what was possible on the African continent. If you look at the African continent, there is absolutely nothing you can't find here. You have, when you talk about mineral resources, when you talk about whatever it is, name it, it's here.
It's here.
Human capital, they have some of the sharpest brains globally. And so what working there sort of, what it showed me is that this is possible. Africa can actually do this. And it made me realize that there was also something very interesting that I picked up. The history of Europe is very much where Europe comes from, is very much where Africa is now. And they managed to sort of get themselves out of that over time and sort of gradually. And I think it reinforced the sense that, wait a minute, we are still on a sort of continuum, historical continuum.
So there is a path.
There is a path, and that if we can get certain things right, get certain ingredients right, that we can get to where
we need
the
to
likes of Europe are, and so
I'm gonna come back to that because there's some I mean, you've written some articles and there are one or two that I'd come across, but I want to focus on, you'd mentioned your time in Parliament initially, the NGO, and you're back in government now. So between the administration that was and the administration that is now, is there sort of an idea on what the mood is, what the idea is, what the sort of mandate is now versus what it was back then when you were working in Parliament?
Yeah. So I think it's still early days for the current administration.
Okay.
And if you speak to officials of government, they'll always tell you that, look, we're still in that
in the forming stage.
You're still in that fifth administration. We're not yet in the new sort of in the new phase of government, where there's a legitimate mandate, etc., from the voters. But for all intents and purposes, there is a bit of a newness, if you will, and I think the difference between where we are now and where we were then was that at that time we were very much finding our feet as a country, both domestically and internationally. There was a lot of excitement, a lot of newness, and a lot of possibility, and a lot of hope, and a lot of just a sense of what it is that could be achieved and what it is that could be possible. I think now there's a bit of fatigue and there's a bit of frustration, and it's evident in the way that you see things playing out. The number of protests, and just the general stories. And I think the mood now is just one of, in my opinion, like a bit of disillusionment with politics, institutional politics as we know them, and just the way that the expectations from the liberators, so to speak, because that's been in South Africa, that's been a sort of fundamental political narrative. We form a liberation context, and I think the mood now is definitely like a general sense of disillusionment and thinking.
We're really tired.
Yeah. And what now?
Yeah.
Sort of. Yeah.
That's so. You mentioned liberation. I haven't seen an example. And you'll need to educate me a little bit. I haven't seen an example of any liberator that has gone on to be a successful leader, whether it's on the African continent, in South America. It hasn't really existed. And what do you think is sort of missing? What is the disconnect between we're struggling and we're fighting for freedom, and then we have the freedom, now what do we do with it? I mean, it's very difficult to sort of say, this is the ABC that needs to be followed, but surely there must be some sort of a path to lay out to say, here are the things that you definitely need to get in place so that you can successfully govern and not fall into the traps that we've seen dictatorships rise from, and the issues that we faced as a country here. So what are some of the things that you think are missing that we don't get once you become a liberator and now you need to govern?
Sheesh, that's an excellent question. And I think a difficult one to answer, I'll be honest with you. And you're right, I think you're quite correct. There's no evidence.
No, there is,
There's been a former liberator that's turned out to be successful.
A ruler, yeah.
So, and I don't know, some of the things on the continent, I think what's been missing is just a genuine commitment to an open political process.
Okay.
And look, as South Africa, we like to view ourselves as the exceptions to that general rule.
Definitely.
And there's a narrative of exceptionalism, and legitimately so in some instances. But we see it in the day-to-day polity where, again, what is missing is this just genuine. Sometimes you doubt the commitment to an open process, where people are willing to say, "Look, we'll go to an electoral contest, as it were, and we'll contest fairly." And I think for me, that's been like a fundamental characteristic of the failures of liberation movements, and also just a general. What ends up happening is that they close rank on themselves.
Yeah, very quickly.
And they sort of isolate themselves from the rest of the society, because you weren't part of us. You never shot a gun. You don't know what we went through.
They become the elite.
And they close rank and so, there's so many brilliant Africans with young Africans with ideas, and those don't get taken on board because you're not part of us, and so they sort of separate themselves from the society. And
that they wanted to liberate.
That they wanted to liberate.
Okay.
And for me, that's a very strange phenomenon. I don't know what causes it, but it happens. And you're sort of seeing it as well in the South African context, albeit differently. It's playing out differently, but just that general characteristic of us versus them. And that for me has been one of the, the sort of fundamental failures, and just the inability to sort of, for former liberators to immerse themselves in the context and be committed to a genuine open process that allows for everybody
to
participate.
be in.
Yeah. Well, that's